Now, many people have jumped on this and assumed that what they're teasing is a double album, confirmation of the double album theory. It seems to be based upon one hypothetical leading to another hypothetical, which when you get down to its core is just a hypothetical itself. But I'm still very far from convinced that we're getting another album now, that when this tour ends, what they will release is a whole new album. Welp, I was wrong. And I'm glad that I was. I certainly was not willing to bet on the fact that they would be releasing another album so soon after Clancy. But I'm not going to complain. And as I think I did mention, in fairness to my former self, a number of times in the past, I'm not totally surprised this happened. It's not completely out of their character to do something like this, to surprise us with a brand new album so soon after releasing a 14-track album less than a year ago. And certainly the way they did it is very characteristic of 21Pilots, leaving cryptic clues everywhere and letting us hunt and speculate for almost a full year at this point. But no, I did not expect that we would be getting a full-length album in 2025 from 21Pilots. And it is unprecedented that they would do this. If we look back at the history of their release schedules, we see consistently that every album was 2 years apart, and then they took a hiatus, which set the trend of having each album be 3 years apart. And now that trend, or that cycle, if you will, is broken, and we have 2 albums in 2 consecutive years back-to-back being released. Now, there has been some debate online as to whether or not this technically counts as a double album. I don't think the terminology matters, but I do get, from a technical perspective, why it might not, right? Because when this first double album theory began circulating, it was assumed that that album was going to very quickly follow up to Clancy. But instead, it will have been, by the time this new album actually comes out, about a year and a half since the last one. So technically speaking, that isn't really a double album, but nonetheless, the spirit behind the double album theory remains the same, which is that they would release a second full-length album much quicker or much faster than any of us really expected that they would, or certainly than the normal trend would be for them to do. One thing I was somewhat correct on was the fact that they would be releasing something in June. I was guessing later in June than June 12th, but nonetheless, it does seem like they have a number of different releases scheduled for June, and so I'm not totally surprised that the first single is coming out in June. But enough about myself and my mistakes. Let us look at this new album and the new album announcement which accompanied it. The new album is called Breach. It will release sometime in September. The date is not yet specified. The first single, The Contract, will be coming out June 12th. And we have here a little tagline, if you will, for the album. Hello, Clancy. Hello, blurryface. Let's finish this. And then a return also to the logo which they had during the blurryface era, which they also have continued throughout that as well. But certainly in the look and the color scheme for this album, it is very reminiscent of blurryface and that era. As some people have remarked, we have the red eyeshadow back on Josh. So it's kind of blurryface meets Clancy meets Trench, if you consider the sound of the title. Which brings me to my next point. Was this the real sequel, the real follow-up to Trench? As I mentioned, in, I think, 2021, during the Scaled and Icy era, before the pandemic hit, they were working on a sequel to Trench. But then they abandoned that project and shifted in a different direction in order to work on Scaled and Icy and to do something that was a bit more upbeat, as they put it. And of course, that introduced a new chapter of the lore in which Clancy is imprisoned in Dima and, forced to perform this propaganda piece. And then following that, we got the album Clancy. And so, of course, when Clancy came out, there was a lot of speculation that perhaps this was the sequel to Trench that they had mentioned. But there's also been theories abounding that if they had a sequel to Trench already lined up or halfway through the writing process, that perhaps Clancy was not fully that, and perhaps there was another album. And that is part of what fueled these double album theories, right? The idea that they had something already in the works, already almost finished before they even started writing Clancy. So perhaps this album, Breach, was the originally intended sequel to Trench, the one which will finish the story. But instead, they took a couple of years to further explore Scaled and Icy and then explore and delve into the character of Clancy himself. And sort of Scaled and Icy and Clancy did that as a two-part almost, right? They're both kind of about Clancy and his story. Clancy is dead, followed by Clancy. Along with the announcement that a new album is coming, they also released some new branding, a new styling of letters for the title, obviously. The branding and styling for 21 Pilots itself has remained the same, but this is obviously different to Clancy that we saw before, and just a larger image of the cover. But they also released for pre-order 2 merchandise items, which are first pressing editions of a vinyl, which is bright yellow, and a CD as well. Now, everyone's a little curious what first pressing edition means. Some people have pointed out that it has the same initials as FPE, so perhaps there's a connection there. But most likely, I think it is just an exclusive merchandise item, since they do like to release such things. In terms of the album art itself, I was, at first glance, somewhat disappointed when I saw this. It seemed just a little bland, a little too much like a simple studio shot, a promotional photo shoot of the band to be an album cover. There also isn't any text on the cover, which, unless I'm completely misremembering, is a first for 21 Pilots, as long as you don't count their self-titled album, which also didn't have any text on the cover. But as I looked at this more and more, I began to appreciate it more. And obviously, as you continue to look at it for a few more seconds, you can see that subtle skull start to jump out at you. So I'm curious to see whether or not this is supposed to represent a skull itself, like a symbol for death, or if perhaps this is supposed to be a symbol of blurryface leering over them as the torchbearer tries to give Clancy his jacket, and Clancy ignores him, and then perhaps turns and follows blurryface instead. Certainly, if you look at it sort of as a sequel to blurryface, perhaps instead of Trench directly, that symbolism would make a lot of sense. And there also was a similar sort of image in the art for the album Blurryface. Obviously, everyone's familiar with that image. And then, of course, there is the name itself and the significance that this name has. Certainly, it was hidden throughout the different FPE letters that we got during the European leg of the tour. People were uncovering this word breach. But what does it mean for the story beyond that? I believe there is a letter which explicitly mentions the word breach, and the significance of that most likely is that there was a breach into the walls on the city of Dima, allowing the Banditos and Clancy to attack and break in. But also, taken in the context of the FPE letters, and the letters between Torchbearer and Clancy, it's also very likely that this was a breach of trust. And then, of course, that coupled with the fact that the first single is called nothing other than the contract, a breach of contract. It seems most likely that at a bare minimum, this has a double entendre, right? It's a breach in terms of breaching the walls of Dima, and it's also a breach of faith, a breach of contract, a breach of trust between two people, or between a leader and his followers. Perhaps Clancy, by taking this absolute power, as he mentioned in his latest letter, is a breach of the trust that the Banditos had in him. So all of that remains to be seen. Of course, come June 12th, that song will probably enlighten us more as to what the significance of all of this is, and set up what this album really is going to be about. But needless to say, I am very excited and in no way disappointed that I was wrong about the fact that they would release another album in 2025. One more outstanding clue that isn't fully answered was the number 6/25. Of course, that could just be referring to the year 2025, and the number 6 is irrelevant or referenced something else, and we've just been forcing it into connection with the year 2025. That is entirely possible. And certainly, the Clancy Ultimus Capitilius 25 seems to indicate more this year rather than June or anything relating to 6. But one other possible interpretation can be reached if you remember way back during the Trench era. An interview, I think it was somewhat of an obscure interview, that Tyler and Josh gave, in which Tyler mentioned with great emphasis that Trench was their third album, not their fifth, not counting self-titled and regional at best, because he started with Vessel, their first studio album, and he made it very clear that he thought of Trench as the third album. And I thought at the time that that was significant, partly because they've always just kind of shuffled regional best to the side, but they do still include the self-titled one, and it is on Spotify, for instance. So why was it so important that Trench would be the third? Well, there may be other theories and lore-related reasons that you can find for why Trench had to be the third, but whether or not that in and of itself is important, it does speak to the fact that if they consider Trench to be the third, then Breach would be the sixth album. So perhaps 625 simply meant the sixth album in the year 2025. But with that being said, this was just a brief update talking about this very exciting announcement from 21 Pilots. I'm very curious and eager to see what will be coming in the following weeks and months as we go through June and the rest of the summer and get more songs and music from the band. Let me know your thoughts on this new album, anything which jumped out to you which I completely missed, or anything which you found to be significant and I kind of glossed over or missed the real significance of. And as always, don't forget to subscribe for more music commentary and reviews.